Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The Raven's Call signals unseen horrors. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The First Call. The town of Black Hollow had its share of strange tales, but none were as chilling as the one whispered about the Raven, a dark omen that appeared before unspeakable tragedies. Mothers warned their children to stay indoors when they heard its call, a mournful cry that lingered in the air long after it stopped. The locals believed the Raven saw things no one else could, carrying the weight of secrets better left buried. Evelyn lived on the outskirts of town, where the dense forest seemed to swallow the light by mid-afternoon. She had chosen this solitude after the accident, a desperate attempt to escape the guilt that clung to her like a second skin. She was a mid-30s single mother, worn thin by life's relentless blows. Her days were filled with quiet routines and the unspoken distance between her and her son, Sam, who hadn't been the same since the day everything went wrong. Late Leon Strombrooks. A low, throaty croak echoed from outside, cutting through the stillness. She sat up, heart racing. Outside her window, perched on the sill, was a raven, its eyes black and unblinking, staring straight at her. The bird's presence felt wrong, unnatural. Its call was louder than it should have been, reverberating off the walls like a warning bell. Evelyn's breath hitched. She closed her eyes, willing the bird away, but when she opened them, the raven hadn't moved. It was still there, watching her, its head tilted, as if it knew something she didn't. Evelyn forced herself to turn away, convincing herself it was nothing a trick of exhaustion, a figment of a restless mind haunted by past mistakes. She closed the curtains tightly, shutting out the raven's gaze. But the eerie cry continued to echo in her ears long after she'd buried her head under the pillow. The next morning, Evelyn tried to dismiss the encounter as a bizarre coincidence. She was stressed, overtired, and still reeling from everything she'd been through. It was just a bird. But as the day wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Sam had woken up screaming from another nightmare, his small body trembling as he described dark wings and a voice that whispered secrets he couldn't understand. He clung to Evelyn, his eyes wide and glassy, his drawings filled with black scribbles that vaguely resembled feathers. Evelyn felt the edges of her reality fray. She distracted herself with chores, drowning out the intrusive thoughts with the hum of the vacuum and the clatter of dishes. But when night fell and she put Sam to bed, she couldn't help but glance at the window. The raven returned, tapping against the glass with an insistent rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Its eyes followed her, tracking her every move. It didn't call out this time, but Evelyn could feel the weight of its silent demand. She pulled the curtains closed, but the tapping continued, persistent and unnerving, burrowing into her mind like a needle prick that wouldn't heal. As she lay back in bed, Evelyn tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the raven's presence lingered. Its unblinking stare haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder that something was coming, something she couldn't see but could feel creeping ever closer. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Past. Evelyn sat at the edge of her bed, still rattled from the bizarre encounter with her reflection. The house had grown suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She ran her fingers through her hair, her mind drifting back to the painful memories she'd tried so hard to bury. It always came back to her sister, Leah. It had been 10 years since the accident, but the wound was as fresh as ever. Leah had been just 13, vibrant and full of life. Evelyn had promised to watch her that day, but she was distracted on the phone, arguing with her then-boyfriend. Leah had gone out on her bike, ignoring Evelyn's distracted warnings to stay close. When the car hit, Evelyn wasn't there. She had arrived moments too late, left only with the sight of her sister lying still, eyes empty. The guilt had never faded, only festered. Now, with the raven's shadow looming over her life, it felt as if Leah's death was reaching out from the past, haunting her in ways she couldn't escape. Determined to find some semblance of an answer, Evelyn spent the next few days digging through the town's archives. Black Hollow had always been a place of whispered secrets, but the deeper Evelyn delved, the more unsettling the patterns became. Old newspaper clippings told of tragedies tied to the appearance of Raven's mysterious deaths, sudden disappearances, suicides that made no sense. The Raven wasn't just a bird in these stories. It was an omen, a harbinger of doom that preyed on those already on the brink. Evelyn's heart pounded as she read one account from 1952. A woman had seen a raven outside her home every night for a week before her husband's unexplained death. Another story from the 1980s described a child who fell seriously ill after claiming a raven spoke to him in his dreams. The boy never recovered, and the doctors were left baffled. Each story seemed to mirror Evelyn's growing fear, echoing her own descent into madness. The next morning, Evelyn was jolted awake by the sound of Sam coughing a deep, rattling noise that sent her rushing to his room. She found him drenched in sweat, his small body curled up in bed, eyes glazed and unfocused. Panic clawed at her throat. She rushed him to the hospital, but the doctors could offer no explanation. No fever, no clear symptoms, just a child whose health was slipping through her fingers. Evelyn sat by Sam's bedside, feeling utterly helpless. The raven's call seemed to haunt her, even in the sterile hospital room. She heard it in the rustle of the trees outside, in the faint hum of the air conditioning, a constant, nagging presence that wouldn't let her rest. She wondered if it was punishing her, feeding off her unresolved guilt and fears. Returning home with Sam that evening, Evelyn's nerves were frayed. As she tucked him into bed, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Black feathers scattered across the room, thin and glossy, as if plucked straight from the raven itself. Every window was tightly shut, no way for a bird to have entered. The sight of the feathers, stark against Sam's pale blue sheets, sent a shiver through her. Evelyn's hand trembled as she picked up one of the feathers, its edges sharp and sinister. She clutched it tightly, feeling the world tilt dangerously beneath her. The raven wasn't just watching anymore. It was inside her home, inside her mind. She backed out of the room, shutting the door softly behind her, but the feeling of the feathers lingered on her skin, a reminder that she was no longer in control. The raven had its claws in her, and it wasn't letting go. Chapter 4. The Descent. Evelyn's hands shook as she backed away from Sam's room, the sight of the black feathers still vivid in her mind. She tried to push down the rising tide of panic, but every corner of the house seemed to hold a shadow that wasn't there before. That night, sleep was a distant hope. When she finally dozed off, it wasn't peaceful. She found herself in a dream, a warped version of her home, where everything was distorted and gray, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She stood in the living room, disoriented, when she heard it, a soft, mocking call that echoed through the walls. She turned, and there it was, the raven, perched on the back of her worn-out sofa, its feathers glistening in the dim light. But this time, it wasn't silent. Its beak opened, and from it came Leah's voice, painfully familiar and accusing. "You left me," the raven croaked, its eyes never leaving Evelyn's. Leah's words twisted, filled with bitterness and sorrow. "You should have been there." Evelyn's breath hitched as she stumbled back, clutching her chest. The room spun, the raven's call growing louder, each note slicing through her mind like a knife. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with life. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness, and when she looked back, the raven was gone, replaced by a reflection of herself older, more haggard, eyes hollowed out by years of guilt. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her pulse racing. The line between dream and reality felt razor thin, and she could still hear Leah's voice, faint but persistent, in her ears. The nightmares only grew worse as the days passed. She saw the raven everywhere in mirrors, in shadows, even in the faces of strangers. It taunted her with Leah's words, twisting her memories into something monstrous. Evelyn's friend, Mina, noticed the change. "You need help, Evelyn," Mina said one afternoon, her voice soft but firm. They sat in Evelyn's kitchen, sunlight filtering weakly through the curtains. Mina's concern was genuine, but Evelyn could hear the underlying doubt. "This isn't just stress. You're seeing things that aren't there." Evelyn clenched her fists, struggling to keep her composure. "It's real, Mina. I'm not crazy. The raven. It's here for a reason." Mina sighed, reaching out to touch Evelyn's arm, but the gesture felt distant, ineffective. "You've been through so much, but you have to consider that maybe—" "I'm not imagining this," Evelyn snapped, pulling away. "It's not just in my head." Frustrated and alone, Evelyn spent the next sleepless night digging through old boxes in the attic, desperate for answers. That's when she found it, an old, faded diary with her grandmother's name etched on the cover. The pages were brittle, the ink smudged, but the words were clear enough to send a chill down her spine. Her grandmother had seen the raven too, just before her own untimely death. The entries spoke of a curse, a dark omen that stalked their family, and detailed a ritual that could banish it, a ritual that required a sacrifice, a price Evelyn wasn't sure she was willing to pay. That night, Evelyn felt a presence in the house, heavier than ever. She crept into Sam's room, heart pounding, and froze at the sight before her. The raven was there, perched calmly on the bedpost above Sam, its beady eyes locked onto Evelyn's. It didn't move or make a sound, just stared with an unsettling intelligence, as if it knew far more than it should. Evelyn stepped closer, her breath ragged, but the raven didn't flinch. It watched her, unblinking, holding her gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Evelyn knew then that the raven wasn't just a visitor. It was a harbinger, a silent judge weighing her sins. And it wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 5. Unraveling Reality. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she backed out of Sam's room, the raven's piercing gaze seared into her memory. She barely slept that night, her mind a chaotic blur of images: her grandmother's diary, Leah's accusing eyes, and the relentless, unblinking stare of the raven. Every creak of the old house felt amplified, every shadow threatening to leap at her from the corners. She couldn't tell if she was dreaming or awake, the boundaries between reality and nightmare slowly crumbling. It wasn't long before Evelyn began seeing things that shouldn't be there, dark figures skulking at the edge of her vision, slipping away whenever she turned to confront them. In the stillness of the house, whispers floated through the air, faint yet unmistakable. They called her name, distorted echoes of voices long gone, mingling with Leah's familiar taunts. Every mirror reflected not just her face, but Leah's, staring back with empty eyes, a cruel reminder of the past Evelyn could never escape. One evening, while standing in her dimly lit kitchen, Evelyn's neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, appeared at the door, her expression a mix of concern and unease. "Evelyn, are you okay? I saw you outside last night, wandering the streets. You were talking to someone." Her voice trailed off, and Evelyn's stomach twisted with dread. "I wasn't outside," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. But the look in Mrs. Hargrove's eyes said otherwise. "You must be mistaken." Mrs. Hargrove shook her head. "You were alone, Evelyn. I'm worried about you." As the door clicked shut behind her neighbor, Evelyn felt a surge of fear. She had no memory of leaving the house, no recollection of wandering the empty streets, let alone talking to anyone. Was she truly losing her mind? The thought sent a jolt of panic through her, and she retreated to the attic, clutching her grandmother's diary as if it held the key to her sanity. Driven by desperation, Evelyn decided to attempt the ritual detailed in the diary. She gathered the required items: candles, salt, a rusted iron key, and set up in the basement, where the air was thick with dust and dampness. The instructions were vague, ancient words scrawled in shaky handwriting, but she followed them as best she could, hoping to rid herself of the raven's curse. As she began chanting, the room seemed to darken, shadows creeping up the walls like smoke. The raven's call echoed, louder and more menacing, and Evelyn's voice faltered. Suddenly, she heard Leah's mocking laughter, sharp and bitter, filling the space around her. It was like a knife to her heart, a reminder of every failure, every regret. She tried to press on, but the raven swooped down from nowhere, its claws raking across her arms, tearing flesh and fabric alike. Evelyn screamed, stumbling back, blood running down her skin as the raven's eyes glowed an ominous red. Then everything went black. Evelyn woke hours later on the cold basement floor, disoriented, her hands slick with dried blood. She looked around, confused and terrified, her memory a fragmented blur of terror and pain. Her wounds stung, but what shook her more were the deep gashes left on her psyche, the echoes of Leah's taunts still ringing in her ears. Stumbling to her feet, she made her way upstairs, her movements sluggish and disjointed. She found Sam sitting in the living room, crayons scattered around him. He looked up at her, eyes wide and distant, then turned back to his latest drawing. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The page showed a haunting image of her surrounded by a murder of ravens, their black wings outstretched as if ready to devour her whole. The raven's call echoed faintly, and Evelyn knew her battle was far from over. Chapter 6. The Unseen Horrors Revealed. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, staring at Sam's drawing, her breath shallow, her mind teetering on the edge of panic. The ravens on the page were crude, but unmistakably menacing. It was as if Sam had glimpsed the same dark visions that haunted her every waking moment. She glanced at him, but his gaze was distant, lost in some place she couldn't reach. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Evelyn's past and present were bleeding together in a way she could no longer ignore. Leah's face flashed before her eyes, those moments from years ago replaying with relentless clarity: the accident, the screams, the suffocating silence that followed. Evelyn had buried those memories deep, but now they clawed their way back to the surface, tangled with the raven's eerie presence. It wasn't just a bird, it was the embodiment of every shadow she'd tried to outrun, every regret she'd pushed down until it festered. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the living room. Evelyn jolted up, rushing in to find the raven perched on the mantel, its wings spread wide, casting monstrous shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. But this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of ravens appeared, grotesque and distorted, their bodies unnaturally large, eyes glowing a sickly red. Evelyn's heart pounded as she realized she was the only one who could see them. Sam remained oblivious, still lost in his drawing, humming softly to himself. The ravens filled the room, their forms flickering between tangible and spectral, an overwhelming presence of dread. Evelyn stumbled back, her vision blurring as reality and hallucination collided. The raven nearest her opened its beak, and instead of the harsh caw she expected, it spoke in Leah's voice, dripping with contempt. "You can't hide forever, Evelyn. The words cut through her, a blade of raw truth. Evelyn backed into the wall, her breaths ragged as the room spun. The ravens moved closer, their whispers merging into a cacophony of Leah's voice, recounting every mistake, every failure. Evelyn clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound seeped into her mind, relentless and accusing. "You left me," the raven taunted, eyes boring into hers. "This is your doing." Evelyn fell to her knees, the weight of her guilt crushing her. She hadn't just lost Leah, she'd lost herself in the process, drowning in a sea of blame and self-loathing. The raven's eyes never wavered, locking her in a gaze that burned with every unsaid apology, every unshed tear. "Stop," Evelyn screamed, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you." The room fell deathly silent. For a moment, the ravens seemed to flicker, their forms wavering like shadows caught in a flickering light. Evelyn's confession hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The raven's head tilted, its once fierce eyes now glinting with something almost akin to sorrow. It was vulnerable, its power over her momentarily shattered by her admission of guilt. But Evelyn's relief was short-lived. The raven's form shifted again, its beak opening wide, as if to devour the very air around her. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Evelyn sensed a crack in the raven's armor, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim her life from the shadows that had consumed it. The house remained silent, but the echoes of Leah's voice lingered, reminding Evelyn that she still had a fight ahead of her, one that was as much within as it was against the horrors that stalked her from the outside. Chapter 7. The Price of Silence. The raven loomed over Evelyn, its silhouette blocking the fading light streaming through the window. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that mirrored the chaos within her mind. The air was thick with an electric tension, the raven's presence a constant reminder of her unresolved guilt. Evelyn gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles white as the raven's call pierced the silence. It was a haunting melody, each note echoing the weight of her choices, the haunting refrain of her past mistakes. "You can't escape, Evelyn. Not now, not ever," it crooned, Leah's voice intertwining with the raven's call. With every pulse of its call, Evelyn felt herself teetering on the brink of madness. The room spun around her, reality fraying at the edges. Memories of Leah flooded back, moments she wished she could erase. The laughter, the fights, the day she lost her sister in a blink of an eye. Every recollection wove itself into the fabric of her torment, trapping her in a web of guilt and sorrow. In that moment, the raven shifted, its eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "You must choose," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "Sacrifice something dear, and you will be free. Or accept this burden as your penance. The choice is yours." Evelyn's heart raced. What could she possibly sacrifice? Her relationship with Sam? No, she couldn't bear to lose him. He was all she had left of Leah, the laughter echoing through their home, the drawings that now haunted her. Yet, the raven's call was relentless, a deafening chant urging her to make a decision before the darkness consumed her whole. The thought of living with the raven's torment for the rest of her life sent a wave of despair crashing over her. She had already lost so much. Perhaps freeing herself from this curse required a sacrifice she had yet to comprehend. It was a cruel irony that the very thing keeping her connected to Leah now threatened to destroy everything she loved. As the raven's call crescendoed, Evelyn felt a deep-seated resolve rise within her. She stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not let you dictate my life any longer." The raven's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment, Evelyn saw something shift, fear or respect. She couldn't tell. In that moment, she understood, to be free, She had to confront her deepest fear, the truth she had kept buried. Tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Leah. I didn't mean for this to happen." The raven let out a furious caw, the sound reverberating like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of her world. In her heart, Evelyn felt a tremor, a sense of loss for the sister she had loved and lost, but also an inkling of clarity. She was ready to face the pain, ready to sacrifice the silence that had protected her from the truth. With one final, desperate breath, she declared, "I let you go, Leah. I let you go." The room exploded with sound, a cacophony of raven calls, shrieks, and echoes of her sister's laughter. Evelyn crumpled to the floor as the energy swirled around her, the overwhelming force pushing her to the brink. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Silence fell, heavy and profound. The raven disappeared, leaving only the smell of feathers and the warmth of a memory. Evelyn lay there, breathless and trembling, the weight of her decision heavy upon her. She was free, but the price had been steep, and she would never be the same. The darkness had receded, but scars remained an indelible mark of the journey she had undertaken. As she wiped her tears away, she realized that while she had lost something dear, she had also gained the understanding that healing comes through acceptance, through acknowledging the past rather than hiding from it. Chapter 8. A Lingering Shadow. The sunlight poured into the living room, spilling over the worn couch and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. It had been a few weeks since Evelyn confronted the raven, and the shadows that once lurked in every corner seemed to have retreated. Sam was on the mend, his laughter slowly returning, echoing through the house like a long-forgotten song. She found solace in his recovery, yet a gnawing sensation clung to her, a reminder of the darkness they had escaped. Evelyn busied herself in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast. The smell of pancakes filled the air, mingling with the sounds of Sam's soft giggles as he played in his room. She smiled, her heart lightening at the thought of a normal day, but every time she glanced at the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Later, as they sat together at the dining table, Sam slid a drawing across to her. His fingers were stained with charcoal, a testament to his creativity. Evelyn picked it up, her breath hitching in her throat. There it was, a raven, but not just any raven. One eye was distinctly human, staring back at her with an intensity that sent chills racing down her spine. She turned it over, her pulse quickening, but the back was blank, void of any explanation. "What do you think?" Sam asked, tilting his head to gauge her reaction. "It's interesting," she replied, forcing a smile. "Very unique." The unease gnawed at her, echoing the sensation that had lingered since the night of her desperate confession. While Sam was recovering, a part of her remained trapped in the shadows of their shared trauma. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that they had faced the worst and emerged stronger. But as the days passed, the air around them felt charged with something unspoken. That evening, as twilight descended, Evelyn took Sam for a walk around the neighborhood. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows on the pavement. With each step, the memories of their past clung to her, like the tendrils of mist rising from the ground. She glanced at Sam, who skipped ahead, unaware of her internal struggle. They reached a park at the edge of town, where the trees loomed like sentinels against the fading light. Suddenly, a familiar call broke the stillness. Evelyn froze, her heart racing as she looked up to see a raven perched silently on a distant tree. Its dark feathers glistened in the fading light, and it watched her with an unblinking gaze. "Mom, look," Sam exclaimed, pointing at the bird. "It's just a raven." Evelyn forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow in her ears. "Yeah, just a raven," she echoed, though she felt anything but calm. The The raven's call echoed faintly in the wind, sending a shiver down her spine. As they turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not as free as she had hoped. The horrors might have receded, but the memories lingered, buried just beneath the surface. That night, as she tucked Sam into bed, she glanced at his latest drawing one last time, her heart heavy. The raven with the human eyes seemed to peer into her soul, a reminder that the shadows of their past might never fully vanish. In the quiet darkness of the room, she understood, while the call of the raven had faded, the fear it had instilled would forever linger like a haunting echo, a specter she could never fully escape.